Hi, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists and authors about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. David Daley is the senior fellow with Fair Vote, and he is the author of the new book, Anti-Democratic. He also has written two other books that we love, Unrigged and Ratf. He is joining me right now to talk about the impact of last night's vote in Virginia on their redistricting referendum and why the gerrymandering fight seems to have backfired on Donald Trump and Republicans. David, welcome back. Always great to have you, especially after a night like this.
Thanks for having me back. I love Lincoln Square.
Oh, thank you. Well, let's take a look at the maps in Virginia before and what we think they'll look like after, because it's a pretty dramatic change. So it ended up being a tight 2-point margin on this referendum on redistricting, and that is far closer than last November when new Democratic Governor Abigail Spanberger won the state by 15 points. As someone who has written extensively on gerrymandering, what are your thoughts, David, on what happened last night with this redistricting vote?
Yeah, this is a big deal for Democrats in Virginia. This is going to go from a 6-5 map currently to likely a 10-1 Democratic map. That is a pickup of 4 seats. Now, I think Democrats would likely have picked up 2 of those districts in the fall anyway, but they certainly would not have gotten beyond 8. This really takes the national mid-decade redistricting that is going on since Donald Trump called Texas last summer and said, find me an additional 5 seats. And it pretty much pulls it into a draw for the time being. Florida can still go, and they may still go in the next couple of weeks. I think it's possible for Ron DeSantis to get a seat or 2 out of Florida, but in this current blue environment, they may not want to risk having a new map backfire on them. The other crucial piece here is that the U.S. Supreme Court is still mulling its decision in a big Voting Rights Act case that could open the door to new maps across the South that really cut back on Black and Latino representation across the South. It's likely too late for that decision to impact the 2026 midterms, but any decision could come down and certainly be a time bomb waiting ahead of 2028. So I would say that, short term, this really evens the map for Democrats around the country. Long term, there's, a lot of structural problems still exist and have to be looked at.
Yeah. I know you've called this a gerrymander Armageddon, where we've got multiple states that are doing midterm redistricting. Obviously, Donald Trump kind of kicked this whole thing off last summer when he explicitly ordered Texas to find him 5 more seats, which they obliged him on. I think that the approach that we've seen in some blue states that's worth talking about, because this wasn't just legislatures in California and Virginia drawing Democratic maps. They actually had to go to voters because, in California, they have an independent redistricting process. They had to go to voters and they said, this is a temporary measure that we're taking. We want your approval. Are you willing to go along with this? California, it was, very successful. This was a tight fight in Virginia. Can you talk with us about kind of what the differences were with Prop 50 and what we saw in Virginia, and about this kind of more measured approach that we're seeing from Democrats versus just kind of the hammer approach that Republicans are taking on redistricting?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that what Democrats did in California and Virginia was go to voters and say, we have these constitutional guardrails in effect, but we think that this moment calls for real urgency and real pushback. And voters in both of those states agreed and said yes. And really, this is a question that, comes up because we have a national congressional map, right? That, both sides have to fight to win 218 seats on. But when some of those states are dramatically out of whack, when trying to fix this problem becomes almost impossible, because anytime any state goes ahead and does the right thing on redistricting and draws a fair map, it's essentially unilaterally disarming and surrendering to those states that are behaving poorly and maximizing partisan advantage. And don't get me wrong, both parties have done this over time and currently. Republicans certainly kicked it off in the middle of this decade, taking what most observers had thought was a much more balanced map in 2021 than it had been in previous decades. And Republicans began the process in Texas and then Missouri and North Carolina of upending that. And, Democrats, instead of meekly saying, go ahead, actually push back in California, have pushed back in Virginia. Now, I think that these extreme gerrymanders are bad for democracy, whether they're done by red states or blue states. And really what all of this underlines is that we have got to have a national solution to a national problem. So much of what is happening right now is taking place because this U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts back in 2019, they had a real opportunity to solve the partisan gerrymandering problem once and for all. Reformers in states around the country had made an awful lot of progress. There were, real standards that were coming into play that federal judges appointed by presidents of both parties were using to overturn extreme maps drawn by both parties, by Democrats in Maryland, by Republicans in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina. And the Roberts Court said no. And they turned their back on voters. They turned their back on a solution to this problem. And here we are in the middle of a free-for-all that I fear is going to get worse before it gets better.
I know that you've written extensively about the Republican State Leadership Committee's red map strategy during the 2010, 2011 census and then redistricting, and how that really set up Republicans very well for their dominance for at least part of the decade in Congress, with the huge gerrymanders that they were able to achieve in states like Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin. We've seen that Republicans have not hesitated in recent decades to play hardball with this. So when Donald Trump tells Texas, find me 5 more seats, do you think the calculation was that Democrats would once again bring a knife to a gunfight and they wouldn't retaliate?
I do. I think the Democrats have not played much constitutional hardball over the course of the last 15 years. Democrats fell asleep on redistricting back in 2010. And, I think you could pretty safely say that the response to the authoritarianism being pushed by this regime has not risen to the level of true constitutional hardball. I think you could look at what Democrats did with their trifecta, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, and they failed to really move the kind of big structural reform, whether on gerrymandering, whether on fixing the U.S. Supreme Court, on adding additional states that might help balance the U.S. Senate or the Electoral College. So Democrats have been bringing a water gun to these fights now for some time. The fear that I have is that Democrats take a look at what happened in Virginia and say that this is the solution and this is the way to go, because the math is still not with them long term. Right. If the Supreme Court comes down with this decision in the Calais case, which I don't think is going to affect the 2026 midterms, but I do think at this point, you're looking at somewhere between 12 and 19 seats, according to Fair Fight Action, that could be a turn from blue to red across the South for 2028. And how Democrats are ready to respond to that, how Democrats are ready to respond to what I imagine will be a return to maximal Republican gerrymandering. Republicans could have gone further this year in Indiana, in Kansas, in New Hampshire, in Kentucky, and Tennessee. They did not do that. They left some seats on the table. So I imagine that come 2028, Republicans will have the advantage of Calais. They will have those additional seats. Democrats are going to have to find a way to counter that. And that's, in the ballpark of 20 seats. I imagine you'll see them come up with a very aggressive new map in New York. You may see Democrats looking to unwind commissions that have been passed in Colorado, in Washington, in New Jersey. I still don't think that gets you close to the 20. So I think the math on this still favors Republicans, and that if Democrats think that by playing constitutional hardball, Republicans will stand down, I'm not sure that's the case. And we haven't even gotten into the 2030 apportionment that will follow this coming census, in which states like California, New York, and Illinois are going to lose seats. And those seats are going to Texas, to Florida, to North Carolina, to Georgia, where they will be drawn by Republicans. So the long-term arc here is really, really important for Democrats to be thinking about, and not to be too blinded by the success of what happened yesterday.
Yeah, let's talk a little more about that Calais case, because it really is one of the most consequential cases that, the Supreme Court still has to render an opinion on this term. And it not only does that impact congressional seats, but there's a downwind effect on how state legislatures are drawn as well. And so this could be just cascading losses for Democrats across the South. And not only just for Democrats, but just for representation for African-American voters. I mean, this really would undo the last bit of Reconstruction and the Voting Rights Act. This is extremely consequential. And based on what you're saying, it sounds like a foregone conclusion that the Roberts Court will do this and dismantle Section 2 of the VRA.
It's usually a safe bet that the Roberts Court is going to dismantle the Voting Rights Act whenever it gives itself an opportunity. And this is certainly a case that John Roberts and Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, Brett Kavanaugh have been looking for a long time. It's a case out of Louisiana, and it has to do with the constitutionality of using race at all to draw districts. And essentially what the Voting Rights Act and its various reauthorizations over the years have said is that where it's possible to draw a majority-minority district, where there's an opportunity to do so in a state where the voting bloc, lives in a fairly compact area, and where there's a history of racially polarized voting in those states, you have to go ahead and draw a district. You can't just crack and pack those voters in order to advantage the other side and cut them out altogether. If the Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional, which in all likelihood I think they will, it will lead to new maps in Alabama, in Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Missouri, where the St. Louis seat falls under the Voting Rights Act. Texas and Florida could take another look at their maps. Several other states. And Stacey Abrams' group says this is as many as 19 seats. I think it could be closer to a dozen. But the reality is that's a big number of seats. It is a lot of representation. You will begin to see, states like Alabama, which currently have 2 Black members, probably all white delegations in these states. You're absolutely correct as well that there is a downwind effect on state legislatures. That this would be, a catastrophic decision for, multiracial democracy in the United States.
A lot of Democrats and independents have strongly backed independent redistricting commissions and fair maps in states across the country, like in Michigan and Arizona. And I'm wondering, seeing just such a close result last night in Virginia, did this impulse for basic fairness, among the Democratic base, did this really hurt the Yes campaign?
I wonder, I mean, Virginia passed reform on redistricting in 2020, and it passed with more than 60% of the vote. So certainly that number fell off, pretty dramatically. 6 years later, voters in Virginia said, we want to try something else, go another way. The stakes are too high in this moment for us to, not maximize a map here in order to retaliate for the gerrymanders that have taken place elsewhere. Again, I think what's really important here is we can't fix this state by state. If we're trying to fix it state by state, it's only going to get worse as state by state until we get to the point that the entire map is completely frozen. And I think that, a lot of states have tried independent commissions. I don't think independent commissions get you all the way there. I think a more proportional map is really the kind of fix that, state by state across the entire country brings you to real fairness everywhere. Mm-hmm. And maybe in this moment of, maximal gerrymandering and this Armageddon, both parties can say, well, it's time to, stand down. And perhaps then standing down will look something like a more proportional impact in every state. Don Beyer and Jamie Raskin have a great bill called the Fair Representation Act. Larger multi-member districts use proportional ranked choice voting, and every state ends up looking pretty much like its politics. Every district is a swing district. Gosh, all of us could participate in a meaningful congressional election. I've never done that. I think that we are in what is a dark moment that's probably about to get darker as all of these states jump in. There will be consequences when Calais comes down. Many other states are probably likely to jump in. Some of the reforms that have been won in the last 10 years will probably be jeopardized. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to have to take a big look. Maybe once it's wreckage every place, people can say, okay, how are we going to put this back together again? There are solutions, but it's going to take a national solution that actually brings fairness.
And how do we get there? You mentioned the bipartisan legislation. Obviously, currently we have Republican House and Senate, and so I'm just going to handicap it and say it's probably not going to pass this term.
Probably not.
But I mean, one of the things that has always made redistricting reform so difficult is that you have entrenched interests. You have people with extreme self-interest, which is how we got to the point of trying to have these independent redistricting commissions to take the power out of their hands. So what's the plan to move forward? How can we see some real reform that clearly we need?
It's why we needed the courts to stand up for voters, because when it comes to redistricting, you can't always trust politicians. And listen, if Democrats are going to play constitutional hardball, I think they have to attach that to a real democracy agenda. They have to go to voters and they have to say, we're going to play constitutional hardball in the service of fixing this system that is so broken that it can be taken over really easily by authoritarians. And here's what we're going to do, and really spell it out. And I think that means a more proportional House. It means looking at apportionment of the U.S. Senate, which by 2035, not that long from now, we're going to have about 70% of the population in 15 states, which is essentially a blockade of the U.S. Senate. I think it involves looking at the Electoral College and how we elect the President of the United States. And it involves looking at this Supreme Court. which, no matter which side of the political fence you're on, I think we should all be able to agree that no 9 people in a democracy ought to have this kind of lifelong tenure to essentially be a super legislature and make these kinds of decisions with life tenure that are non-reviewable, and then they're able to time their retirements to be picked by a president of their choosing. It's deeply anti-democratic, deeply problematic. And Americans understand this. If you look at the support for things like term limits or real ethics code for the US Supreme Court, it's 75% of us. That's not a partisan question. So I think Democrats have got to attach constitutional hardball and a democracy agenda. And if they have a trifecta in 2029, say this is what we're going to do in our first 100 days to restore things. I don't think it's uncommon that this kind of change is driven by one party. If you look at some of the big structural changes in American history, whether it's Reconstruction, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement, much of that was driven by one party. But Democrats are going to have to move fast because the structural reform window is going to close on them. Apportionment in 2030 is a big deal. The Senate map is very difficult. The apportionment in 2030 is going to change the Electoral College map. It's going to shift many more electors away from California, New York, towards Texas and Florida. The map for Democrats in 2032 is going to be much different than the map in 24 and 28. They're going to have to find a way to win in more states if they want to win at the White House. So acting on behalf of actual majorities and convincing Americans that this is not partisan, but that it's in the service of true majority rule, I think is going to be really, really important, and they ought to get started now.
One thing that we haven't talked about as much is that Donald Trump was in the White House for his first term for the last census, and that was just riddled with all sorts of issues, both in terms of perhaps competence, but also trying to put your thumb on the scale, and
plus
even
COVID.
though, I'm sorry,
plus COVID,
which complicated everything exponentially. Donald Trump should not be in the White House, according to our Constitution, for the next round. But there have been some reports that already his administration is taking radical steps to try and alter this process. So what kind of impacts could we see on the redistricting process in 2030 as a result of that?
It's a great question. Whoever controls, this administration has done serious harm to the administrative state. They have gutted these bureaus. They have pushed out, talented, experienced veterans. Conducting a U.S. census is a difficult activity. It needs to be done by people who have done it before. And this administration has pushed all of those folks out in favor of hacks and loyalists. They have talked about, trying to change the way congressional districts and representation is counted from, counting all people in a district, as the Constitution says, to just counting U.S. citizens, maybe even just a U.S. citizens above voting age in a district. That would be a huge change. How these districts are counted and how accurately they are counted has huge questions of representation and dollars attached to them. The current estimates suggest that somewhere between 10 and 12 seats will change after apportionment, and that it's going to be mostly small states like Rhode Island, and maybe Montana losing seats, and then some of the larger, industrial blue states that have been losing population, New York, Illinois, and then California, and the states that are gaining. you're looking at Texas, you're looking at Georgia, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Those are all states where Republicans largely control the drawing of maps. And when you move electors away, if you move 10 or 12 electors away from blue states into red states, Democrats either have to find a way to win those states, or they have to, find other states that add up to what has changed. If suddenly Texas and Florida have, additional electors. So it is the structural problems facing Democrats are large. There are more of us than there are of them, but increasingly that doesn't matter.
Right. And then there's also geographic issues within states where a lot of blue voters tend to live in large cities. And even as suburbs have become bluer, it's still a concentrated geographic area. And so what we've seen in many states, blue and red, is that it's just so much easier to pack Democrats into, these districts, whereas Republican populations tend to be more spread out. And so can you talk a little more about that as a challenge? Because I think that is a particular issue at the state legislative level for Democrats.
Absolutely. I think it's a challenge at the state legislative level, the congressional level. Take a look at Pennsylvania as an example, right? Republicans back in 2011 were able to draw themselves a 13-5 map in Pennsylvania. Even when Democrats and Barack Obama carried the state in 2008 and 2012, the Democrats only won 5 of 18 congressional seats because of the way that Republicans drew those lines. I think it would be really difficult to draw a map the other way around. And that's because of the geographical challenges that you suggest. You would have to slice, Philadelphia into lots and lots of little strands and then essentially run them across the entire state. And that in turn would likely dilute minority voices and would probably not go over well with the Congressional Black Caucus or those who say we are the heart and the base of the Democratic Party, and you're going to diminish our numbers in the service of electing more rural white Democrats from elsewhere in the state. So it's easier for Republicans to do this in Pennsylvania, in Michigan,
Ohio, Wisconsin,
Ohio and Utah, Wisconsin, than it is for Democrats. In many states, even if Democrats were to attempt a gerrymander of Wisconsin, if they took complete control of the state in 2026, I don't think they'd be able to gain anywhere near what Republicans have been able to do when you look at just mere numbers, and that's geography.
Right. Well, before we let you go, David, let's just return back to Virginia briefly. So now that this referendum has passed, you do have former Governor Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, who's calling on the state Supreme Court to overturn this decision, the decision of the voters. How do you see this playing out?
I have a hard time seeing that the Virginia Supreme Court is going to step in here. There's a process in Virginia when it comes to passing a constitutional amendment. Right, it has to be approved by voters after it is approved in 2 different legislatures, and Republicans are counting on something really technical here. The way the language was written, where it was posted. Was it, posted in a courthouse in a certain place? They're talking about going back to, rules from a couple hundred years ago to try and overturn this. I'd be really surprised if that was successful. I'd also be, And while one should never look for consistency from the U.S. Supreme Court when it comes to voting questions ahead of an election, I would think that if this got appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court, they would put a pause on any additional new maps because we're getting too close to the election, right? Certainly in 2022, when there were, questions of a racial vote dilution in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, the court said, yes, those questions are there, but it's too close to the election. So
Right.
that abounded to the gain of the Republican Party that year. I guess we'll see exactly what happens at Virginia's Supreme Court and then perhaps at the U.S. Supreme Court. But I have a feeling that this 10-1 map is going to be in place.
Great. Well, David, thank you for stopping by again and talking with us. David's new book is Anti-Democratic, and you can get it now. What are some other ways that people can find your work?
You can find me at FairVote, which is fairvote.org. You can find me at Blue Sky, where I am Dave Daley. You can find Anti-Democratic and Unrigged and Ratf wherever books are sold. Just not that place owned by Mr. Bezos. There are other places online, and great local bookstores everywhere where you can find these.
Great. Well, thank you so much again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for Lincoln Square.